Can America defend against an invasion from China? Out of all the potential doomsday scenarios, one of the most interesting to think about is the possibility of one of the world's greatest superpowers attacking another of the world's greatest superpowers. This would be a war on a scale seldom seen in human history, and if China did commit to an invasion of the continental US, it would be an undertaking of absolutely colossal scale, and the question becomes whether the United States has what it takes to be able to push back. Now, in modern times, the United States of America are often seen by experts as being nearly impossible to directly invade. In the last 100 years, Pearl Harbor is the only example of a major military operation performed by an enemy nation on American soil, with the possible exception of several captured German spies during World War II. A large part of this is due to America's relative isolation compared to many countries in Europe and Asia. With both Canada and Mexico being long-term allies of the United States, there's no neighboring country that has a risk of invading across the borders of their land. And if any country that wasn't Canada or Mexico tried to invade across either the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean at the east or west coast respectively, they would have an incredibly difficult time making landfall. The US coastline is incredibly well equipped to know if anything is coming, and any invasion force coming by air or sea would be almost immediately detected and able to be defended against, if not outright destroyed before ever reaching landfall. And even if China was able to deploy troops that couldn't be detected by American radar and somehow avoided detection, grabbing some sort of foothold on American soil would be nearly impossible. With major cities like Boston and New York in the east and Seattle and Los Angeles in the west, there are plenty of major cities that may seem like appealing targets, but would be heavily protected by the US military and fully capable of becoming a base of operations to push any landing Chinese forces back out into the sea. Without the ability to create any form of controlled zone for the Chinese, any invasion would be depending entirely on supply lines across the ocean and have no ability to bunker down with defenses. It would almost be a better idea for China to attempt invading either Mexico or Canada and then attempt a more land-based invasion, but even then, the United States would never allow China to establish a military foothold that close to their mainland. Chinese forces at sea would be intercepted as much as possible, and even in the unlikely scenario that China could gain a foothold in Canada or Mexico, taking advantage of that foothold and pushing onto American soil would be incredibly difficult. Much of the borderland between Canada and the US or Mexico and the US is relegated to rural communities and wilderness, ideal terrain for guerrilla attacks or bombing defenses if a land invasion began to occur from either the north or south. Now, modern United States military doctrine revolves around the concepts of power projection and full spectrum operations. Power projection is all about the idea of being able to apply military pressure at any point on the globe, no matter how far that point is from America's natural borders, with as little travel and setup time as possible. The idea is that America's military capabilities should be viable anywhere on the planet, a relatively new idea when you consider the thousands of years of previous military human experience that were forced to think much more locally due to the time period they lived in. While America's focus on mobility and potential military maneuvers anywhere on the planet might be useful for some form of counterattack against China, or potentially even cutting off Chinese supply lines if the invasion was a more sustained effort, America's focus would have to be on its own country's immediate defenses rather than their usual tactic of taking advantage of their global presence. The full spectrum operations philosophy, meanwhile, means that America's military might is never focused just on attacking or defending, but on a combination of both potentials and combining civil support operations alongside any destructive intentions. This would be especially important if America were defending against invasion on its own shores, as maintaining infrastructure and keeping civilians safe would be enormously important to keep overall American morale up and to keep the situation from turning any bleaker. Another important consideration around America's military doctrine would be whether the United States was already engaging in war with another country at the time that China decided to invade. You see, under the leadership of LBJ during the 1960s, the United States had a two-war policy, at the height of the Cold War even reaching a two-and-a-half-war policy. This meant that the United States Armed Forces should be fully ready and capable of fighting wars on 2.5 different fronts at the same time. During the 60s, this was understood to mean that in a worst-case scenario, the United States should be able to hold off a war in Europe against the Soviet Union, while simultaneously fighting in Asia against either China or North Korea, and be able to fight a small war in the Third World if needed, which was considered the half portion of the 2.5 war policy. However, in recent times, this policy has been altered as the realities of modern war become more complicated and technology reliant, with the current system being implemented in the 90s by President Bill Clinton under a new policy called Win, Hold, Win, meaning that the United States must at all times be capable of winning one war front while holding back the forces of another long enough to be able to decisively win against both enemy parties. While the US is not currently committed to a large war against any enemies at the moment, several countries could take the initiative during a Chinese invasion to cause trouble at other locations around the globe, usually protected by US involvement, further complicating things for the invaded country. The one area where China might have an advantage over the US initially during an invasion would be through sheer numbers. With 2.2 million active personnel compared to the US's 1.4 million, China would definitely have more soldiers deployed to a battlefield, especially if they were the invading force. With current estimates putting their reserve military personnel at around 8 million, almost surely some of these forces would also be upgraded to active if a military campaign as large as invading the United States was required. This means that on a man versus man level, the US would be severely outgunned. Fortunately for America, the US military would still have the advantage for literal guns. With a military budget nearly 3 times the size of China's for a much smaller force, American tech would be a huge advantage for the US side when combined with all of the previously stated advantages for their country's location. It doesn't matter how many people you have to shoot guns when the Americans can just bomb those people before they even have a chance to reach the shore and pick up arms. At the end of the day, a direct invasion from China anytime in the near future is an incredibly low possibility, but it's a question that's still interesting to discuss and ponder about. The world is so interconnected that such a drastic action would cause a tidal wave of cause and effect across the globe, completely changing how many countries relate to one another and potentially reshaping the entire geopolitical makeup of the planet. And while America's military might should prevent it from being flat out invaded for many, many years to come, it's still a good idea for the strongest military not to get too complacent. You never know what the future might be holding for all of us. So do you have any more big questions you're yearning to get answered? Be sure to like this video, hit the subscribe button, and let us know down in the comments below what questions you'd like to have answered next. As always, I've been Josh Busker, and this has been Life's Biggest Questions.